welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Justin Clark,
I'm Mattimore Cronin.
and today marks the 1 year anniversary since we started this podcast. And we decided to do something a little bit meta for you guys. We're going to discuss the future of Hence the Future. So we'll talk a little bit about the future of our research, the future of our content, and the future of our guests. And then finally, we'll just discuss how we want to expand into totally new areas, such as maybe hosting live events. And also, we have a special surprise gift for our listeners at the end of this episode, so be sure to stick around. But first, maybe let's talk a little bit about why we started this podcast in the first place. So, what do you think,
Yeah.
Madam?
So Justin and we've been having these conversations even before this podcast began, where we would just talk about the future on a weekly basis anyways, because we're interested about it.
Mhm.
So initially we were like, oh, why don't we just publish these ideas? And part of why we think it's so important to publish the ideas of the future at this time is because when you think about the whole course of history and the whole course of humanity, right now we are very much at the edge of the hockey stick curve of
Yeah.
technology. I mean, if you think about from the time that we were born, I was born 1991. You're probably born like what, 93?
93, yeah.
And that was when computers were very much in their early stages. Like no one walked around with a smartphone at that time. And
Yeah.
if you go from that time to where we are today, and then fast forward in our life to where computers are smarter than the smartest human being, I mean, this is some of the most interesting 50 years in the whole course of
Hmm.
humanity. So to be able to catalog what is going on, all the technological changes throughout that time, and then
Yeah.
also to help educate and inspire people so that we can choose the best possible future path by seeing all
Right.
the possibilities, the worst case, the best case, the most likely, and do whatever we can to get to that best case.
Mhm.
That's in my mind why, I was really excited to start this podcast with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we came into it with very similar motivations. There is just so much happening right now, and there's also a lot of information.
Hmm.
It's hard to parse out what is good information and what is bad information a lot of times. And we want to be one of those sources that people can trust, that
Hmm.
we approach things from a level-headed perspective. And I'm sure people have listened to this and realize, yes, we have opinions. It's not like we are totally unbiased.
Hmm.
Everybody has biases when they have conversations about something, especially if they truly care about something. But we like this is also a way for us to clear our own heads and have clear thinking
Hmm.
around things, because there's going to be times when you listen to one of our earlier episodes, and let's say a couple years from now we say something totally contradictory. Historically that might be a bad thing, but what I think people should realize is this is something that just symbolizes that we've evolved our thinking. And
Right.
that's one thing that we need to make sure that we do is we don't just get ingrained in one particular pattern of thinking, because there is no necessarily best way of thinking right now. We just need to use this as sort of an optimization of our own thinking process, and by default, or hopefully expand that to our listeners. And that's one thing that I've gotten from like Sam Harris's podcast or Joe Rogan's
Yes.
podcast, or
I mean, the whole intellectual dark web, I think what makes it unique is that people have very nuanced opinions and they don't always line up with the left or the right or
mm,
different political ideological lines. They're on a
mm,
case by case basis. And people in the intellectual dark web are unafraid to evolve their thinking as new information comes in. And so
mm,
we try to operate in that way as well because if you look at the main media outlets out there, like CNN and Fox News and you know
mm,
a lot of what's on Facebook and goes viral on YouTube, and
right,
a lot of it
yeah,
is just very much about party politics, identity politics, and we
mm,
try to steer clear of that so people, no matter what your personal ideology is, you can get some opinions that aren't based on any ideological line.
mm,
And maybe that's a good transition to talk about our research because we want to make it clear to our listeners that each of our episodes, we don't have these. I mean, of course, we always start with some hypotheses of how we think the future is going to change, but it's
Hmm.
not like we come up with the conclusions first and then try to find data to back it. We very
Hmm.
much try to find the data first and then build our predictions based on that initial data. So maybe you can
Yeah.
talk a little bit about what our research process is for each episode and what tools we use to get the right research.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this has evolved since we first started and will continue to evolve. Because at first we just kind of we did our own research separately and just kind of read articles, or maybe we had books that we had read at
Mm,
some point and just refreshed on those, or Blinkist, or something like this that
yeah.
kind of lined up with our topics, and then we had a conversation. And at first, we tried to plan out the episodes a little bit. Like the first few episodes were very planned out, and then as we moved into later episodes, we realized that, oh, we can have a better conversation if we just have like a
Just the
few bullet
questions.
points.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few questions, some bullet points that we want to like maybe hit at some point, but not necessarily.
Hmm.
And what we do is we just have, at least now, we have just broad data, and there's this service, Statista,
Yeah.
that kind of gives us good statistics about pretty much anything that you could possibly want and good visualizations, which is really nice. And we can kind of get an overview of what the state of certain things are.
Right. So
And
we
that's a good starting point. But yeah.
totally. Yeah, so we start with the broad topics where for something like 3D printing, let's say, we all want to know, okay, what's the current state of the technology? Who are the major players? What are the
Hmm.
use cases that are applicable now and in the future? And once we get a sense for what the question marks are, like what we want to explore, then we find the data in Statista. And one of the more recent additions to our research process is we now have a PhD researcher who every week uses the Statista information, does his own scholarly research, and then comes up with a summary of sort of what he thinks the current state of affairs are for that topic, and then we can extrapolate and think a little bit more about the future. And
Hmm.
I guess thinking about how this could evolve and become even better over time, we've talked about it would be awesome if we had a subject matter expert in each of the main domains that we tend to address. For instance, like
Right.
finance, artificial intelligence, biology. Uh,
Hmm.
so all of these areas are end up being recurring themes. So having someone who can be sort of the expert in that area and can sort of manage the research process, I think that's
Hmm.
something we'll grow into. But even
Yeah.
now, I mean, just having a third objective person to do the scholarly research, because a lot of times it's hard to find the right sort of scholarly articles and information if you don't come from the world of academia.
Right.
And so I think that's been a really good optimization that we've made.
Oh yeah. I mean, just trying to read a scientific paper without coming from academia is kind of a feat because, if you don't have any sort of mathematical literacy or know the jargon of whatever field you're trying to read a paper on, it just makes it super difficult. And that's one of the problems I see with traditional media and the research that they do. If there's like a big research finding, for example, and then BuzzFeed writes an article about it,
Hmm.
a lot of times there's just like one or two things that are just
Like
taken
coffee
from a
cures
research.
cancer, when
Yeah,
like the
like it's
actual
just
research
these.
study is like people who drink coffee are correlated with lower
Yeah,
rates of cancer.
yeah,
And
they immediately draw causation.
right.
They confuse correlation with causation, and it's sort of a problem, and that is partly because of the lack of statistics education, and a lot of journalists have, but also just there's a lot of information out there, and
The
it's hard to
attention
parse that if
economy.
you're.
You're
Yeah, I
trying to
mean,
compete with everyone else.
if you have like you have to be an expert a lot of times to read this, and journalists by default can't be experts in everything in the world. Like
Hmm.
it's impossible. That's why they aren't researchers, like
Right. Like I
academic researchers.
like it was interesting. You know, Kevin Rose is a pretty famous columnist in the New York
Hmm.
Times, and he writes about technology. And he had written one piece about how Facebook does not do enough of a good of enough job in vetting all of their content, and like, oh, the Christchurch shooting video was up for 15 minutes before it got taken down. Like that is unacceptable. And then he wrote another article later about how the moderators are having all of these psychological effects from looking at all of this horrible content that they need to
Oh,
vet
wow.
through. So it's sort of like he's saying they need to do more moderation, and then he's ripping them for moderating, even though like it's not, algorithms aren't good enough to do it without human input right now.
Right.
So we see that a lot where it's just kind of like you're only taking one narrow view of a subject rather than
Hmm.
taking the holistic, like high level view, considering all the pros and cons, best case, worst case, how this is going
Right.
to play out. So that's something we try to do that's different
Mhm.
than journalism, where it's not like we have an agenda or like a thesis that we're trying to push. It's more like
Yeah.
we're trying to give our listeners a high level overview of a topic so they can feel informed and they can make better decisions in their own life to get us collectively to that best case scenario.
Hmm. And one more thing I'll add to research before we maybe move on is I would like us to get to the point where we do enough thorough research to where our scenarios, especially our likely scenario, starts to match up more and more with reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that shows you, our listeners, that we are, we actually think about this deeply, and that we, have some sort of forecasting ability in this space, and that just having better research is a better way for us to be accurate. And I think
Totally.
that's something that we should try to focus on, is actually being as accurate as possible. Almost like how Nate Silver's Nate Silver, right,
Yeah,
from 538.
538.
He's a statistician that makes these predictions all the time, and sometimes he's way off, but you
Right.
can't always be right. The idea is you make these predictions and you have, a little bit of something on the line, even if it's just your reputation, by making these predictions.
Right.
And
Although
and
I would
then
say that Nate Silver takes a almost too objective of an approach where it's all based
uh
on polling and that kind of thing. And I don't think he takes enough stock of what's happening on the meta psychological, like how something feels, that level. And that's
right,
something that
yeah.
I think Scott Adams does a really good job of, where
Hmm.
he's not about like, oh, what do the facts say? He's about what's the most persuasive and therefore what's going to drive human behavior on a
Hmm.
basic, like, reptilian brain level.
Right.
And so we try to take both of that into account. And I kind of feel like that's why we're a good pairing, because you're
Hmm.
more like the Nate Silver, like, what does the objective data say? And I'm more like, what's more persuasive on like a psychological level.
Right.
So it's
Right.
good to incorporate both of those.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think we do this podcast too, is it would be sort of boring if we came into it with exactly the same opinions, exactly the same way of thinking.
Right.
Um, so that's one thing that I enjoy about this.
Yeah. Maybe we can discuss the future of our content now. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so most of our content so far has been focused on Instagram. So if you haven't followed the Hence the Future page on Instagram, I would definitely recommend it, because we highlight some of the most interesting aspects of whatever that week's topic is in a visual way, sort of
Hmm.
similar to The Economist, where we'll show a visual of, let's say, for quantum computing, here are all of the top quantum computers in existence today. And then we'll write a fairly thorough caption of that post with all of our high level findings. Like,
Hmm.
here are the main players in quantum computing. Here are what differentiate these players, the number of qubits that they've achieved, the level of accuracy they've
Right.
achieved. And we do this for every one of our episodes. So every week we have 3 posts related to that topic, and
Hmm.
we sort of give a microscopic view of what an interesting aspect of that topic could be. So
Hmm.
I think that's been, and we've gotten a lot of traction on Instagram, more so than any other platform. We also
Right.
publish all of our full podcasts in video form on YouTube. So if you're more
Yeah.
of a visual learner, you can watch those.
Yeah,
And we
and some
also,
people really like, I mean, just like the Joe Rogan experience, they really
yeah,
like the video. And it would be cool at some point if we have a studio where we're like in the same place and we can invite
right.
guests and stuff like that. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, but so yeah, YouTube, I think, yeah, we may evolve where it's more like Joe Rogan or The Daily Show or, um, whatever else, where you actually show what we're talking about. So it's not just a picture of us in the video, it also
Right,
shows what we're discussing. So I
right.
think that would be a natural next progression. And then on Twitter, we share any interesting statistics or things that we find. And I think we're going to evolve that by sharing even more statistics with each episode
Mhm.
because we do so much in our research. But I guess like if I were to say one area with our content that I would most want us to evolve into, it would be short form animated videos that
Mhm.
give the high level overview of what each episode has found. So very similar to Kurzgesagt,
Yeah.
which is in a nutshell. You can search
It's
it
a
on
YouTube
YouTube,
channel, yeah.
and basically they'll take a really complex topic like nuclear energy, and they'll do a video about here are the arguments in favor, here are the arguments against, and then here's how you can think about it taking both of those arguments into account. So
Hmm.
we would like to do that and work with animators because a lot of people are more visual learners. And
Hmm.
if we can distill our findings into a 4 minute, 2 minute video that has cool animations so you can get visual stimulation while you're thinking about these ideas, that
Right.
would be my preferred next expansion for our content.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And I will also just say that like you've done an awesome job with the Instagram. It looks so good. I would
Thanks,
like
man.
anybody should go check it out because it's I mean it's just a pretty page. Like it's so symmetric. You've got the
Right.
black titles all on one column and it just looks really good. Um, but yeah, then maybe to kind of expand one more thing that we've talked about before is having a more scientific paper associate, not necessarily like a publishable scientific paper, but sort of a
Like a
white paper
research
associated,
summaries.
yeah, associated with each episode where we have all of the sources and everything else that summarizes everything and also why we say certain things that we said. It's almost like a defense
Right.
of the conversation and of the predictions that we make.
Yeah, I mean, if I were a fan of Hence the Future, like just a listener, or if I were just who I am and I'm have another potential source, my ideal
Mhm.
source would be you can just search by topic, like the future of nuclear, the future of quantum computing, and then at a glance you can just see here are the key points with the
Mhm.
sources, with the statistics, and then here's the worst case, best case, and most likely based on those statistics and that research. And
Mhm.
at a glance, if people can use that as a resource, I think that
Mhm.
would be incredibly valuable. And it would very much be in line with our mission of just trying to inform people so they can make better decisions and choose a more optimal future.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's I think that covers a lot of where we're going and what we're thinking about with content. Did you have any other ideas, maybe like far future content ideas?
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
far future, I would love to have a whole media network. I mean, when you think
yeah.
about like Vox, for instance, or
Hmm.
Vice, like they all started pretty small, but now they have multiple podcasts, multiple publications, they have
Right.
a TV show, like maybe at some point we'll publish a book. So there's a lot of
Hmm.
ways we can expand. But I just
Hmm.
think that the way that most people consume content, short form video is like the best. Really, short form video and podcasting, I would say, are the two most high growth areas. So I
Yep.
think that's short and mid future what we would do. But then
Yep.
long term future, I think we could have a whole media network.
Right. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. because there's so many different avenues that we can expand to, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more on when we talk about expanding to new domains in general. But maybe
Yeah.
before that, we talk about how we want to evolve our like the guests that we invite on, and the
Yeah.
quality of the content that we're putting out.
Yeah, totally. So we have some exciting guests on our
Mm.
schedule. I don't want to announce it now because it might jinx it, but
Hmm.
you guys can look forward to some really high quality and more high profile guests.
Yeah.
Although I would very much like to hear the feedback of our listeners of if they prefer our episodes more with guests or when it's just Justin and I. Because
Hmm.
I know some podcasts I love when they have guests, and other podcasts I'm like, oh man, I kind of just wish it was, just the
Yeah.
main person. Like for instance,
Right.
with Scott Adams, I much prefer when it's just him,
Hmm.
rather than when he has a guest. But for like Sam Harris, I absolutely love his guest episodes. So that's something, if you guys can
Right.
send us a note on that, that would be really helpful in just, creating the best possible
Mhm.
episodes for you guys.
Yeah. And to maybe just touch on that a little bit more, I think it would be great to just have to start building a stronger community with our listeners too. Like we should. I think it would be awesome if all of you listeners that thought anything about us just reached out to us and gave us whatever you had on your mind. If you even if
Hmm.
you hate us, tell us. Like
Yeah.
if there's something that you think that we could improve on, we're open to it. Like we said earlier in the podcast, we don't want to be stuck in our ways, and sometimes certain episodes are better than other episodes, and um, we it's harder for us to improve if we don't have the dialogue with our listeners, because
Yeah.
really the success of this podcast boils down to you, the listener. Do you enjoy what we're talking about?
Hmm.
And it's really important for you as a listener is to to enjoy what we're doing, and we want you to enjoy what we're doing.
Yeah, and if you have ideas for particular guests or particular topics that you're interested in, you can also submit that on our website,
Hmm.
hencethefuture.com.
Yeah.
And yeah, so maybe to bring it home before we get into the future scenarios, let's talk a little bit about how we would expand into totally new domains and what that could look
Hmm.
like.
Yeah, I mean the very first thing that comes to mind is the same sort of thing that we've seen Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and pretty much everybody in the intellectual dark web doing these days, is having open lectures or speaking engagements
Hmm.
where we just have conversations with all of our listeners. It's a way for us to have this podcast with a live audience, to do AMAs, to do anything that we want, and to really engage with listeners in a live setting.
Yeah. Yeah, and we
Um,
have, by the way, for our listeners, we have done a few one-on-one Skype calls with our
mhm.
fans when they just want to go a little bit deeper into a certain topic. So we're open to doing more of that as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think having a live setting where, a lot of our listeners can be together and we can just have open question and answer, I think that would be super valuable.
Hmm.
And then I guess another way that we could go into a new domain would be creating some sort of a think tank or consulting agency or marketing agency or
Hmm.
automation agency, because what Justin and I do for work. Justin's a data scientist and I'm a digital marketer, and we find ourselves being asked a lot by people in our network, how can I grow my account? How can I grow my audience? How can I automate some of these processes that I'm just so tired of doing? And Justin is really the expert on automating business processes and
Hmm.
analyzing data. And I'm the expert on growing a brand and bringing people in through the front doors.
Hmm.
And so it would be natural for us to basically, if companies wanted to hire us or people wanted to hire us and say, hey, what's the future of my business? I have this
Hmm.
online business, and what's the future of it? Worst case, best case, most likely. and we can do an analysis of that business and figure out what the key factors are, and then give recommendations for you can optimize your business in these ways to get to the best case scenario. And not only that, but we can actually implement the automated processes and bring in new people, new customers for you. So
Hmm.
that's one area that we've would just be a very natural way for us to grow beyond the
Hmm.
podcast.
Yeah, and to just expand, like that is not at all self-serving either, because if we work with companies, then we'll be able to help with this transition into this new era that we're talking about, that help businesses thrive in a totally new environment that hasn't
Yeah.
existed before. And that's one of those things that I think is one of the most important things that anyone can do is we need to make the transition easy to get from where people are now, because there's a lot of businesses that just have these processes that are in the Stone Ages still.
Yeah. They're just not going
And
to survive in the next 10 years unless they make some
yeah,
fundamental changes.
we need to start preparing for the automation wave immediately.
Hmm.
And people need to understand what that entails and what can be automated and what can't be automated. So it's more of an incremental, directional step towards that, rather than something that will just hit you like a tidal wave and then everyone has to be laid off because everything is automated, for example. So I just
Right.
think it's better to have a better transition into this new era than what I see currently, where there's just going to be huge disruption and then there's just going to be out of nowhere a ton of people displaced from jobs, for example.
Totally. Yeah, and we already have a sort of an agency set up which is called Noble Growth.
Hmm.
And you can find the website's already live. It's noblegrowth.co. So if you are interested in that sort of thing, you can totally reach out to us.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, anything else as far as like how we might expand into new domains? I mean, I love the live events idea. I love the
Right.
agency idea. I love the media network, publishing
Hmm.
new media. I mean, one thing I guess we've also talked about is we could write a book about the future, like whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And we're actually potentially even more interested in fiction, where we would sort of give people a really vivid impression of what it would be like to live in a certain future. Like maybe we
Hmm.
have a book where, taking all of our various topics into account, here's what a day in the life or a week in the life would be like living in the worst case scenario future or the
Yeah.
best case scenario future.
Right.
And I think that would just be really fun to do anyways, regardless.
Yeah, and it's hard to really do this sort of thing, especially when we're talking about future scenarios in a nonfiction way. Like, yeah,
Uh-huh.
we can bore people with a bunch of facts about where things are now and what that might possibly lead to. But I think it's more compelling to read a story
Oh yeah.
about some sort of future scenario. And that's one of the things I love about science fiction is it kind of gives people this understanding of what's true. And some science fiction writers do a lot of research into things that are like physically possible, like they're possible through the laws of physics, but not necessarily possible yet.
Oh, totally. I mean, I was just at this live event at Neuhaus where the quantum physicist who was consulted for the Avengers and the Ant-Man movies,
Hmm.
he said that pretty much everything in those movies that relates to quantum physics is theoretically and scientifically sound. And we cannot do that yet. We're not that
Hmm.
advanced technologically, but it's all very much possible from a theoretical scientific perspective.
Hmm.
So that's sort of a, good analogy for how we try to create our future scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I think that would be a really interesting way to go. And if we did nonfiction, I view it more as like a book with chapters that are essentially essays
Hmm.
that are it would be a little bit more disjoint, at least the
Or
way I
it could
see
be
it in
more
my
like a
mind.
coffee table reference book where each page is just like one of our episodes and it just sort of gives the high level like statistics and
Yeah,
projections.
yeah.
Like it could be something like that. But yeah, I agree. A fiction book might be more fun and
Uh,
liberating. Um,
right.
yeah, so I think now would be a good time to get into the future scenarios, and then after those scenarios, we're going to tell you guys the special gift that we have for you all. So stay
Mhm.
tuned.
Yeah, so what do you think about the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario.
My worst case scenario is not that bad because it would basically be us doing what we're already doing without expanding much. It's
Hmm.
hard for me to imagine us just stopping the podcast because it's something that we purely enjoy.
Hmm.
And we even had this conversation when we were in San Francisco about in your wildest dreams in 10 years, if you were, let's say you had $10 billion in the bank, how would you actually want to spend your time? And Justin and I both said that we would still want to do Hence the Future podcast. So it's
Hmm.
something that is purely for, it's not purely for our own enjoyment, but we would do it even if there were no other benefits monetarily or,
Uh-huh.
reputation or having a bigger platform or anything. We would still want to do this podcast. So my worst case scenario is you guys can still enjoy this episode every week. And even in the worst case, I would think that it's going to improve steadily, month over month, year over year.
Yeah. Yeah, and mine honestly isn't that much different. My worst case was it's essentially the same, except we don't have any listeners. Like people just stop listening.
Right,
And
right.
but but again, we're still enjoying it. We're still having the conversation. So,
Hmm.
it's not as bad as, the worst case scenario of the future of artificial
Yeah,
intelligence.
right.
So, what do you think about the likely, or sorry, let's go to the best case first.
Best case scenario.
My best case scenario is one in which the podcast has such a tremendous impact on public opinion and the minds of our listeners that we are able to make a dent in the universe to steer the whole reality that we find ourselves in a more optimal direction. So
Hmm.
obviously that's something that's a little bit difficult to measure because it's not like we can
Yeah.
see what the different parallel universes are and measure how good the one we're in has ended up being. But
Hmm.
I think that, you can't say that Joe Rogan doesn't have a real impact on everything,
Oh, I think
on
he has.
public
I think he's one
opinion.
of the most important people
Yeah,
because of how widespread his voice is and how reasonable he is. Like
right.
kind of like what you're saying, if we can be sort of these reasonable people, and also in the best case, we don't get swayed by, you know, this
Trolls.
golden, yeah, trolls, or just like big companies that are trying to tell us what to do and what to say, and we can remain objective, and we can still
Yeah.
be dreamers, but we can remain objective.
And that's
That's
actually one thing that I've found somewhat frustrating is that when we have guests on the podcast, a lot of the times, especially if it's a touchy area, like let's say finance or like law, a
mhm,
lot of people aren't willing to come on the podcast as guests because they're afraid to say what they really think. And
mhm,
that is a travesty. There are too
mhm,
many people out there in the world who are afraid to say what they really think and who also have informed, nuanced opinions that are based on research. The people who do tend to speak out and are the loudest are often the ones who are the most ideological and they're the most hard hitting Republicans or hard hitting liberals. And
mhm,
so for us to still be willing to speak out, but to see things from both sides, and sometimes we may
mhm.
line up more with the left, sometimes more with the right. I think that's something that is just tremendously valuable, and there's not enough of it in the media world today.
Yeah. And that's one of the things about having a community and having conversations with our listeners. Like if your first step as a listener is like, let's say you live in a hyper religious family, for example, or hyper fundamentalist family that wants to, that is very oppressive in certain ways, the only way for you to get out of that is to like have conversations with people, and we can be those
Hmm.
people. Like if we have a community where people feel safe to have these conversations, then that's good, that's being done in the world. People can be more open, and that's one of the reasons we're seeing these Trumps and these Bernie Sanders and all of these more extreme ideologies being extremely popular in the polls. It's because those are the sides that are willing to speak up. There's no one in the middle that's willing to speak up.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I would enjoy. And I've, as somebody who is introverted and definitely is not necessarily the most articulate person in the world, it's this podcast has been, you know, a learning experience. Like I think I've improved, but it's something that we all need to do, no matter what our current speaking capabilities are, whether or not our opinions are fully formed. The conversation is what informs your opinion.
Yeah.
And we just need to make sure that we foster, and we are kind of the fosterers of great conversation and honest conversation.
Totally. And it reminds me, I used to make this joke that all of my best friends are dead, meaning my best friends being like Nietzsche and Albert Camus and Kerouac and Dostoevsky. And but seriously, when I read their work, or let's say Alan Watts, when I listen to his lectures that he gave, I
Mhm.
feel like this is someone whose model of the cosmos and of life resonates so deeply with mine, maybe even to a greater extent than the people who I know in the real world, like the real
Mhm.
physical world. And so if we can make that connection, even with just a few people, where they're
Mhm.
like, maybe they did come from a, conservative or fundamentalist family where they don't encourage people to think for themselves. If
Mhm.
someone, a few people can tune in and hear us and it helps them sort of open their minds to new ways of thinking, then,
Mhm.
I would be just thrilled and very happy with what we've been doing.
Yeah, and that's really part of the best case scenario is making life better for our listeners, making people, and that's one of the things that I've personally benefited from Sam Harris's podcast or Joe Rogan's
Hmm.
podcast, like having people on with different opinions. If I used to be very set in a certain way of thinking, and then a guest comes on that's articulate and has other opinions, I'm like, oh wait, there's so many different ways to look at the same problem. My way is not always right, and I've been wrong a lot of times in my life, but it's good to be able to recognize the fact that we all have our own limitations. But
Hmm.
through more education and through listening to podcasts and reading books, we can educate ourselves in a way that helps us, see the world in a more objective way. And that's what I would hope from our best case scenario is we can just, like you said, make a little bit of a positive dent in the universe.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Well, let's round it out and get into the most likely scenario before we reveal our secret gift.
Yeah.
Most likely scenario.
Yeah, I mean the likely scenario I think would be I think we can achieve our best case scenario. I'm an optimist when it comes to hence the future for sure.
Hmm.
And the likely scenario, I think, to expand into, for example, live lectures and talks, that would be, I think it'll be a while. Like we still have a ways to go before we build our own credibility and our own audience. But the way we do that is by having these better research methods and to make sure
Hmm.
that we have very level-headed opinions on things and we're not overly idealistic or um, ideological.
Hmm.
And that, I think, with everything that we've sort of outlined, we have a path to get to the best case scenario.
Totally.
And I think some things will just take a little bit longer than others because the issue is I mean, we're a relative, or at least we started as relative nobodies. We were people that were educated and had conversations, but we weren't famous by any means, for example. And it takes a while to start from that to become very popular.
Right. And we do
Especially,
have a fairly sizable audience now, and we are
right,
growing
yeah,
at a fairly sizable rate. So it's not like our numbers are struggling at all. But when you compare us to like Joe Rogan or Sam Harris, it's still
yeah,
pretty niche. But
right,
I totally agree with you. I think the best case scenario is very much within our grasp. And what my most likely progression would be is listeners can expect better research and more accessible research in the very short term, meaning you'll be able to go to our website, and if you're just trying to refresh yourself on a topic, or maybe you don't have time to listen to an episode, you can go to hencethefuture.com and just at a glance see our worst case, best case, most likely, supported by statistics and research with quality sources. That's something that is going to happen in the short term. I would
right,
say in the medium term, you can expect us to improve our content with short form animated videos that distill the essence of each episode. And in the long term, I do think we are going to get to a place where we have live events and meetups and have our own think tank, and anyone who wants to modernize their own business can reach out to us, and we can provide automation and growth and analytics. And yeah, I think those are all very likely, and I wouldn't be surprised if we found ourselves in the best case, let's say, a year and a half, 2 years from now, potentially.
yeah. I mean that hopefully the we can keep the growth up, and yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
Maybe I want you to tell listeners about our special gift now,
Okay.
our surprise.
So we wanted to thank our listeners for being with us in this first year of our growth and the formation of Hence the Future. And so we are going to give every person who sends us a screenshot of a review that they've given for Hence the Future on the Apple Podcast app or another app, just wherever you can review us. If you send us a screenshot of your review, we will send you a Hence the Future t-shirt that has our telescope favicon icon. And it's a black shirt. It's American Apparel. It fits really well. It's really soft. People are going
And
to
it's a
want to hug
stitched
you.
logo too. It's
It's a
not going to
stitched
fall
logo.
off.
It's like a Lacoste shirt kind of, but it's just a regular black t-shirt with just a very subtle Hence the Future telescope.
Doesn't even say hence the future
Doesn't
on it.
even
Like
say
it's
anything. It's
you
very
can wear
low
it
key.
anywhere. You could wear it to a place where people totally disagree with us, and they wouldn't necessarily know what you're wearing. It's a super stylish shirt, but you can, it's a cool t-shirt, so I
Yeah.
would highly
And it's
recommend
on our
people take
website if you
advantage.
want to take a look at it in the merch section of our website. So all
Mhm.
you have to do is send us a screenshot of your review and tell us where you want us to send the t-shirt to. And then we'll send it to you guys as a special thank you for being with us on this journey.
Yeah, and one thing too is maybe we can limit this to current listeners, people that are listening to it the week this is released, because obviously people
Yeah,
can listen to it a year from now. So
right.
maybe we say
Yeah,
people
so
that
send us
review it in
it
the first week.
as soon as you can. Like if
Yeah.
you send it to us this week, then we're gonna get you your t-shirt. So
hmm
no worries.
Yeah, I think this is a really cool time for us to engage with you guys as listeners, and it would be awesome if you reached out on a regular basis, like engage with us on social media and everything else.
Yeah,
So,
and we're all fellow futurists here. So
yep.
I'll just end this podcast with a quote, which is that most successful minds are either historians or futurists, because it gives you a certain perspective where you're able to forge a more optimal path. And I think that's what makes us unique, is that we're a community of futurists. And we'd love to hear from you guys. We'd love to send you guys a special gift. So thank you for
what is currently
listening,
happening,
and
what
we'll see
will
you next week.
inevitably happen.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Hey futurists, if you've made it this far, you might be wondering who created the Hence the Future theme song. It was created by the Walden Brothers, and you can find them on Spotify. The Walden Brothers also produced the sound bites for the worst case, the best case, and the most likely future scenarios. At Hence the Future, we're always looking for ways to improve the quality of our episodes and our predictions. To that end, we're building a team of researchers to curate the most authoritative and highly vetted sources as the foundation for every episode. If you'd like to support these efforts, you can donate a small monthly amount at anchor.fm/hencethefuture. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support.